So, Ferdia, how did you get into all of this SDT stuff?
Well, so firstly, it's good to be on the podcast. I've been listening for a long time. I'm very pleased to be talking about SDT, which is self-determination theory, which, as you know, is my favorite topic and obsession. And I look forward to talking about it with you for the next 8 hours. And I should say as well that, we've been close collaborators for a while and also friends. So I hope that you will compensate for that by challenging me in this discussion. But how did I get into self-determination theory? I was investigating the question of income in socialism. So I was asking myself questions like, should people be paid for their work or should they not? What are the effects of money? Should we all just get a 100% universal unconditional basic income? Or should we be paid for the hours that we work? And if so, what about inequalities? Should we be paid the same? Should we not be paid the same? And I was thinking about this because as I thought more and more about post-capitalism, it became clear that the issue of income was central. And it was central because of the effect on motivation and the effect that money and our access to resources and our compensation has on motivation. How do we behave in organizations? How do we see ourselves? How do we see society? Are we competitive? Are we cooperative? Do we try to game the system, etc.? And what happened was I was doing my own thinking about this and reading some things. And one day a colleague from the Participatory Economy Project, Chris, sent an email and he said, well, have you heard about this thing called self-determination theory? It's the psychological theory, et cetera, et cetera. And so I looked at this and I thought, wow, this aligns so powerfully with the way that I'd been thinking, but in so much more of a sophisticated fashion, much clearer, better organized, and most importantly, backed by proof, by experimental evidence, and a huge amount of it. And so at that point, I just threw myself into studying self-determination theory and endeavored to master it so then I could apply it to post-capitalism. And so that's how I got into it. But there's a lot more to say about it.
So tell us then a little bit about the history of self-determination theory. Where did it come out of?
Yeah, I can talk about the history of self-determination theory, but we might want to begin by talking a little bit about why would we talk about psychology. So I'll say just briefly what is self-determination theory, and we'll return more to the details of that. But so self-determination theory, so SDT. So I'm going to say SDT. I'm not going to keep repeating self-determination theory. So it's a psychological theory of human motivation and well-being. It's a very general theory of human nature, essentially, and it originates in the 1970s out of the work of two psychology professors, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. And it is developed into something vast and global and very comprehensive. And we will go well into the details of that. But first, I want to talk about psychology more generally. This is a podcast about socialism, about Marxism, analysis of capitalism and society. So why would we talk about psychology rather than talking about, inverted commas, economics? Talking about growth in GDP and coordination of consumption and investment and all of these things. And I think it's important to dwell on this for a minute. Psychology is completely fundamental. I think a very strong understanding of psychology is something that's quite missing on the left. It's not absent. For example, we've all heard of alienation within Marxism, okay, which has a large psychological component. And there is discussion of psychology, but it can be ignored. And I think that's a real mistake, because the thing is, when we study political economy, we're studying a system which is a system of human beings. And the nature of those agents matters, because if we were different, the outcomes would be different. And so in order to understand how our society works, why it works, and then how to change it, we have to actually understand very clearly how human beings work and what we are. it's not enough, as usual, to just criticize as well, to just criticize Homo economicus and whatnot. We also need to have a positive theory. And this has happened. This work has been done, or this attention to psychology has been paid at various points. We know about, for example, the Frankfurt School and going deep into psychoanalysis and so forth. If we want to understand, first of all, what are the key dimensions to this problem? One is, let's say there's two. There's well-being, there's motivation. Okay. So firstly, we're trying to change society. Okay. We're critical of capitalism. We're critical of the state. We're critical of many aspects of this system and society. So what do we want? We need to have a positive notion of what well-being is. And depending on what our notion of our concept, our model of well-being is, that will determine what society we want to create. And as usual, it's similar about criticizing capitalism without specifying the nature of socialism. We can't just criticize the effects of this society without specifying what well-being is and what creates it. And when we do understand that, that gives us a very direct line into understanding what kind of society we need to create.
So what does STT have to say about well-being then?
Well, sorry, just one other thing. Yeah, so I'm sorry. I'd say the second is about motivation. What actually motivates people? Why do we do what we do? And I think the argument about socialism is primarily, there's basically two arguments. There's one argument about motivation. There's one argument about coordination. And the argument about coordination are things like, how do you harness information that's decentralized and coordinate, many actors in a large system to create a coherent outcome that works for everybody, that kind of thing. But the central argument has always been about motivation, I think. And when you talk to people about socialism, it comes back always to this question of, why will people work? That sounds good, but people are greedy, they're selfish, they're stupid, they're short-sighted, they're uncooperative, they're competitive, and they only do things when they are provided immediate, narrow material incentives. Okay. And so it's crucial to understand psychology so we can actually engage in that debate in an informed way and be able to argue that, firstly, that's an incorrect model of humans. It's grossly wrong, and it's not just an opinion. I mean, that's science. And secondly, to be able to actually authoritatively state, no, this is actually what motivates people. And so that's where self-determination theory comes in. And it's very profound, and we'll go into the details now, but it's important to set up the motivation for why we're even talking about this in the first place, which is this debate about human nature. And I'm going to make a bold claim now and say that I think that this debate about human nature and economic and political systems has been going on for thousands of years. And of course it will continue. And that debate in the context of capitalism and the state has been going on for, let's say, 200 or 300 years. I think we're at a point now where psychological science, primarily in the form of self-determination theory, has provided us the tools, the knowledge to be able to pretty definitively win that argument. We can get to the point now where it's not just, I, socialist, have my values about cooperation and empathy and so forth, and you, conservative or advocate of capitalism, liberalism, so on, have your values about and your opinions about what will work. Actually, we can say with confidence, with proof, actually, this is what motivates people. This is what provides well-being. This is what provides ill-being. And so now we enter into the details of self-determination theory and what that is.
What is it then?
Okay. So like I said, self-determination theory is a psychological theory of motivation and well-being. So what is motivation? Motivation is the energy and direction of behavior. So it's what do we do, how do we do it, and why do we do it? Okay. And then well-being, that's everything from, it's holistic. So it's burnout, depression, anxiety, joy, feeling connected, life satisfaction, personal growth. And self-determination theory covers all of that. It's very comprehensive. And we were talking before we started, it has these 6 mini theories. And each of those goes into detail of a lot of things. But it started on the issue of intrinsic motivation and rewards. That's why I became interested in it. And that's why it's of particular interest to, like this question of, well, why self-determination theory rather than some other psychological theory? Why not just psychoanalysis? Why not just, positive psychology? Or why not this? Why not that? One reason it really struck me is reading is really it engages with and confronts this issue of material rewards in a way that no other theory does. And it links that to a very comprehensive model of the self and our place in society. So it's very broad, and then it's deep as well. So if you want to answer questions like, what effect does paying people have on motivation, you need to know about self-determination theory. No other theory of motivation comes close to having the predictive power and the scope. And it has an incredible ability to absorb other theories. It absorbs psychoanalysis and integrates that into itself. It absorbs other theories of motivation. So, for example, in the 1970s, when it was starting, Deci did these experiments about intrinsic motivation and rewards. So what's intrinsic motivation? Intrinsic motivation is, it's when you do something just because. Basically, it's you do it just because of the enjoyment or interest you get out of that. You're not thinking about external consequences. Like if you go for a walk, it's a lovely day, you go for a walk in the park, the trees are swaying, the sun is shining, you're listening to music. You're not thinking about, what is this achieving? You're just embodied in the moment, enjoying it, interested. Maybe you're listening to the From Alpha to Omega podcast. You're curious, you're intellectually stimulated. You might also, and we'll get into this, extrinsic motivation. You might also be trying to learn something so you can change the world. Okay, that's extrinsic motivation. But the intrinsic motivation is it's just interesting to you. And so he wanted to study or explain the effect of material rewards and on that intrinsic motivation for a task. So some context, many listeners will know about behaviorism. I'm not going to go into all the history, right? I'm going to try to be summary and please try to keep me on track. Effectively, from the beginning of the 20th century, a psychological theory called behaviorism has reigned supreme within the West and then across the world. And in a nutshell, behaviorism is the idea that, I'm being a bit crude here, but humans and animals generally are a blank slate, and we are totally conditioned by our environment. And what determines our behavior is a pattern of stimulus, conditioning of ourselves, and then response. Okay, so your environment provides rewards and punishments. Okay, it could be a threat of violence, or it could be sugar water, or a pat on the head, or $1. That's what determines human behavior. And behaviorism has taken very extreme forms at times, of saying that there's just nothing but that. But anyway, that's one way of looking at things. And so from that point of view, and combined with capitalist ideology and common sense, you would think that providing people immediate material rewards would increase motivation. That's just obvious, right? We all know that. You want to get somebody to do something, offer them some money or something like that, and they'll become more motivated. Well, what Deci found was actually this was not the case. In fact, not only was this not the case, it was the opposite. There were these really interesting experiments that have since been repeated and confirmed, where, for example, you give people a task, let's say a puzzle, something like that, and you ask them to complete as many of these within 15 minutes, or as many that they can complete, okay? Or just to work on it. And you set up two conditions. One is control condition, one is an autonomous condition. So in the autonomous condition, you just let people do it. You say, just kind of do as many puzzles as you want, or do it as fast as you want, or this, the point is that there's no reward. And then another condition, you say, for every, crossword that you finish, we'll give you $5. And then what they do is they see what happens. And then at the end, they go, yeah, the experiment is over. We're just going to go off and finish our paperwork. You just sit here and, actually there's some puzzles there. I mean, you can do them if you want, but the experiment is over. And then what they do is they go around and they look at you through a one-way mirror.
It's quite creepy. Basically, are all these STT people just kind of creeps? Is this what you're saying?
It's all being a creep in the service of humanity. I mean, science itself is basically just one long process of creeping on nature. But anyway, yeah. And so then what they did was they observed how they behaved. Okay, and the question is, this is called the free choice period. So this is an implicit measure of intrinsic motivation. So it's basically, it's not just about how you self-report, because they did that as well. They give you surveys, how interested and enjoyable did you find the task and so forth. But as we know, self-report is subject to all sorts of biases and errors. So they wanted to see how would people actually act? Would they act like they're intrinsically motivated? And what they found was that the people who were in the controlled condition with the material reward would not continue doing the puzzle once the experiment finished. And the explanation is because their motivation for doing it was extrinsic. It was tied to the reward. So in their mind, it was, I'm doing these puzzles because I'm getting $5. Oh, okay, the experiment is finished. You're not giving me the reward anymore. I'm done. However, in the autonomous case, where the motivation was never about a reward, it was intrinsic. So it was, I'm doing these puzzles, playing this game because I'm interested in it. I'm curious. I want to complete it. I find it challenging. And then when the experiment is finished, on average, they would persist much more in performing the task. And so this was the initial evidence and basis for, it's called cognitive evaluation theory. It's the first mini theory of self-determination theory. This gives a flavor of what intervention self-determination theory makes. And it makes in some ways, a lot of what self-determination theory says is actually quite obvious. Okay, particularly if you're a certain type of person. In other ways, it says things that are very counterintuitive and countercultural. And the important thing is that it doesn't just assert them. It tests them either in a lab or in the field. And the work done on rewards in particular can be quite shocking to people, and it can seem implausible. And when you engage with that and you take it to its conclusion, it can lead you to some very interesting places when you engage in political economy.
So STT kind of lays out these kind of three basic psychological needs. Do you want to tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, I would actually. I would, and I'd like to say this is so important. It follows on directly from what I was saying there. So I said that self-determination theory is vast, but there's a small number of core ideas which do most of the work, and those are what I want listeners to take from the interview. Okay, that when the dust settles and the fine details are forgotten, that they remember these things, and the basic psychological needs are part of that. So I'll say self-determination theory says that we all humans have these three basic psychological needs. Okay, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I'm going to say autonomy, belonging, and competence, as some other people do, because it's ABC. It's easy to remember. Relatedness is a weird word. So what are these basic psychological needs? Well, self-determination theory posits that these basic psychological needs are at the root of basically all the major outcomes in motivation and well-being. They appear again and again and again and again. It's a little bit like if you're talking about physics, you end up always coming back to energy. So if you want to understand how people develop personality disorders, if you want to understand how people end up becoming apathetic in the workplace, if you want to understand how people exhibit extraordinary persistence or initiative or even creativity, resilience, identification with the community, if you want to explain outcomes in weight loss or regression, you'll end up returning to these basic psychological needs to explain that. And so I'll say something about them. People have heard of psychological needs before. Okay, many people have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Abraham Maslow, founding figure in humanistic psychology, posited this hierarchy of psychological and physiological needs. So people might think, well, what's the difference with that? Or what's the difference with all sorts of other needs that we have, that are put out there, things which are good for us or we aspire towards. And so the first important point is that these are needs that they thought, the founders and research community of self-determination theory thought, this sounds plausible. This probably is something that is important for people, and we'll put it together. These were needs which were stipulated and then tested again and again and again and again and again, and to see were there actually these cause and effect relationships. So it's really important to say that they're not arbitrary. It's not just an arbitrary list of nice things. And the second thing is, and this is always controversial on the left, is that they're universal. They're truly universal. Okay. These are not relative to culture. And this is a really important point about SDT, is that it is a theory of human nature. And it says that there is a human nature and it can be studied and understood. And it's studied and understood in context, but it exists. And I'm a very ardent member of the human nature left. I don't think that socialism makes any sense if there's no human nature, because we could just mold and adjust ourselves to anything, right? Ultimately. So self-determination theory has a very clear view of human nature. And I should have said this when I was talking about motivation before. It takes this view that counter to behaviorism. So behaviorism, the idea is that motivation comes from the outside. Humans are relatively inert and we're conditioned from the outside through reward and punishment, and our motivation is instilled from there. And if it's not instilled from the outside and put into us, it doesn't exist. Okay. And we can see really obviously, listeners hearing that can tell where that leads to in political economy. Authoritarians across the spectrum rely on this view, and it can be a sincere view. And whether you're a hardcore Stalinist or a neoliberal capitalist, this is the viewpoint that's generally held in common. Self-determination theory takes a completely diametrically opposed view, which is that motivation is innate. So all of us are born innately with motivation. And we have an innate tendency to grow and develop as organisms. And we will grow and develop if the correct nutrients are in our environment and accessible to us. And so the example I always give is of a plant. When you sow seeds in the soil, you don't have to go into the soil with tweezers and pull the shoots out of the seeds. That's not how it works. All you do is you provide heat, moisture, and light, and it is in the nature of the seeds and the plant to grow and develop once those conditions are met. And self-determination theory stipulates and proves that the same is true for human beings, that when those nutrients are available to us consistently in the environment, that we will grow from infants to adults to be stable, well-rounded, integrated people. And part of that is that we will be motivated, and that motivation emanates from within us, and it doesn't need to be instilled from the outside. And so linking this back to the basic psychological needs, I'm talking about nutrients. What are those nutrients? Okay, soil, heat, and sunlight. If we're in the case of plants, for humans, it's autonomy, belonging, and competence. That's our sunlight, our water, and our heat. For us to develop a stable self, to be well attached, attachment theory is very popular now in relationships. For us to be able to emotionally self-regulate, to have a stable identity, to be cooperative and pro-social, to be able to persist, to integrate the values in our community, and so on. All of that depends upon autonomy, belonging, and competence. I should really say actually what those are.
We're only 20 minutes in, yeah. No, it's interesting. It's interesting you talk about the behaviorism, because it makes this kind of very odd kind of scientific claim that there is only a interaction on the outside with the environment to like the shell of whatever the thing is, the human or the pigeon or whatever, but that there's no, the internal structure of that pigeon or human has no effect on the behavior of the organism, only this outside conditioning. It's like, it's a very weird kind of completely non-scientific kind of a conception of behavior.
It's totally absurd. Like, look, we could go into more detail in behaviorism. Like everything, behaviorism became more sophisticated as it had to deal with criticisms. But effectively, behaviorism was blown out of the water during the cognitive revolution in the 50s and 60s. The likes of Chomsky and other people. Self-determination theory was an important part of that. That came a bit later, sorry. But behaviorism is effectively just this reductio ad absurdum of empiricism. And it's we're this blank slate, and it comes from a particular view of science that you can't talk about internal things. That's unscientific. You can't prove it. You can't talk about it objectively. So all we talk about is input output relations, and it's just ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous. and the important part is that I really want to emphasize that it's not just about what makes us feel good. It's that behaviorism cannot explain us. These type of theories, it fails to explain.
Let's talk about input output. It's like central planning, bringing everything to an input output table and ignoring the whole fucking economy.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I was thinking about that. So it's like, humans aren't an input output table. And you know what? Now there are dogs. Now there are pigeons. They all have their own internal nature as well. But anyway, so
what are the basic psychological needs?
Yeah. What are the basic psychological needs? Oh, okay, yeah. I should talk about what they are. So I've talked about what they do, but what are they? Yeah, so autonomy, belonging, competence. I'll go in reverse order. So competence is a sense of effectiveness, mastery, impact in your environment. And it is satisfied through the use of your abilities, the development of your abilities, and optimal challenge. Not too easy, not too hard. And you can get it from moving your body around. There's an inherent energy to using your limbs and so on that all animals experience. And then for humans, there are more complex levels. So for example, do you feel like you're powerless, that you're achieving nothing, you're no good at anything, you try things, you fail, and you're just not growing? Okay, you're stuck in a rut. Okay, that's frustration of competence. On the other hand, you feel like you're using your talents, you're using your abilities, and not only that, you're growing, you're at that frontier of development where you're learning new skills, you're refining what you're doing, and you have this sense that you have an impact and an influence over your environment. That's competence. Belonging, or relatedness. So belonging is a sense of connection with other people fundamentally. So it's a sense that you are accepted, liked, appreciated, and cared for by people who you like and accept and appreciate and care for. So there's a mutuality to it. Okay, there's this mutual fondness and warmth. Do you feel like you're part of a community? Do you feel like you can connect with and have a positive emotional tone and friendliness with the people around you? And so how is this frustrated? Do people belittle you? Are you isolated? That's another thing. Are you just separate from people? Do you not interact with people? Are you alone? When you interact with people, do you find that people show an interest? Do they care about you? Do they do things for you? Do you feel like they only are nice to you out of a sense of obligation, or because they want something from you? Or do you find that people actually value you as an end in yourself? They'll do things to support you. They appreciate you. They accept you. They get you. They remember things about you. They like you. That's belonging. Now, autonomy, I've saved that for last for a reason. And that's because this is the need, the basic psychological need, which is the most easy to misconstrue and misunderstand, and particularly on the left. The left can find it very easy to accept that belonging is a basic psychological need. Also, competence. But autonomy can be very controversial. I mean, autonomy, does that not smack of crude individualism? No. No, it does not.
Okay. Explain yourself.
No,
Big claims.
Autonomy is not isolation from other people. And autonomy is not non-reliance or independence from other people. Autonomy is something more sophisticated. Autonomy is a sense that you stand behind what you do and what you think, and that you endorse it. You have a true sense of choice and agency, volition, okay, true willingness. That is what autonomy is. And you can think about it in the etymology, the Greek autonomos. It's like self-management is literally what that means. Self-regulation. So you are a self-regulated, self-managing entity. So even if I decide, if I have a broken leg and I need to rely on other people to get me around the place and feed me and so on, to rely on other people, I can do that autonomously, because I'm deciding that I'm doing this on my terms. I've got choice. I'm participating in this as someone with agency. You can live in a community and make compromises autonomously. And this is crucial when we talk about political economy, because autonomy is, you cannot understand this reconciliation of the individual and the community without understanding autonomy, the basic psychological need of autonomy. It's one of the missing pieces that allows us to crack open that issue and deal with it in operational terms that you can actually measure. And so autonomy, what supports our need for autonomy? A bunch of things. Firstly, autonomy at its most powerful fundamental level, it's about alignment with the self, with your authentic self. And so it's that somebody whose autonomy is supported is living in alignment with their values, their preferences, their interests. They are able to participate in the decisions that are important to them in their life. They're able to make their voice heard. Their perspective is acknowledged and appreciated. What frustrates it is when people dismiss your perspective, they don't engage with you as an autonomous agent, like you have your own perspective and desire. They don't engage with that. When people use controlling language, okay, you have to do this, you must do that. When you are guilt tripped and commanded, when you're told to do something and you're not given a rationale. This is something it's that humans are fundamentally reasonable creatures, that we require psychologically reasons. So when a great example of this is when there's a sign up that tells you to do something, don't walk on this, or please, or do that, don't do this, don't put this in that bin. Notice how when they give a little explanation for why, you don't feel as much like you're being controlled, because it's like you're participating. That's just a very small example, but it's like you're participating in it as a reasoning creature. So those are the three basic psychological needs.
So how does this autonomy then link into motivation?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so coming back, I was talking about the origin of self-determination theory, talking about these experiments that Deci did in the 70s on intrinsic motivation, this motivation when you just do something because you're interested or you enjoy it or because of the challenge. And I was talking about how people's intrinsic motivation decreased and was undermined when people were given tangible material rewards. Okay, so the basic psychological needs entered the picture. And so now we're experiencing something very profound, which is the interaction now between these basic psychological needs and motivation, and how these two constructs come together to explain human behavior. And so how did Deci and others explain this phenomenon? Well, this is how they explained it. They explained it through the basic psychological need for autonomy. And what they said was that when people are given this tangible material reward, $5 for every puzzle that you complete, people's need for autonomy was undermined. It was frustrated. And that was because, I mean, there's a lot on this. It's because people no longer felt like they were making the decision for themselves for their own reasons. Now they felt like they were doing it because some external thing was controlling them. And that undermined their sense of autonomy. And I mean, I don't know how technical I should go. There's this, I'll throw out some technical things and, listeners can, there's this construct called a perceived locus of causality. Okay. And so people went from having an internal perceived locus of causality. So it's like you have yourself and you have the sense that the choice is truly coming from within you, to having an external perceived locus of causality. So now somebody or something outside me is making me do this. And that undermined this need for autonomy. and therefore the intrinsic motivation decreased. And so I'm talking about this one experiment, but there have been so many more experiments then, and it's broadened out to many kinds of motivation. And the picture that develops is that not just intrinsic motivation, but all healthy motivation, we'll talk about that now, we need to talk about autonomous and controlled motivation, depend upon these three basic psychological needs of autonomy, belonging, and competence. And the basic picture is this: it's that when in the environment people's need for autonomy, belonging, and competence is satisfied, they will, all else being equal, experience optimal motivation. And when these needs are frustrated, they will not experience optimal motivation, and they will experience unhealthy and dysfunctional motivation. And maybe now is the time to expand on what that means.
What does that mean?
Thank you. I'm so glad that you asked me that. Okay, so actually a lot of people will have heard of the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and that does a lot of the work. One of the things about, so we said intrinsic motivation is what? Intrinsic motivation is you do something, the motive is that you're interested, you enjoy it for its own sake. Okay, you're not looking at consequences. And then extrinsic motivation is the opposite, sort of. You're doing a task because of the effects, the consequences it will produce. And many theories or ways of thinking about psychology will stop there. And they will sometimes talk as if intrinsic motivation is good and extrinsic motivation is bad. But as I alluded to earlier, this is actually much too simple. Within extrinsic motivation, you're looking at consequences. There's a whole world of difference and reasons. Everything from I am going over the top of the trenches because I am afraid that my officer is going to shoot me in the back of the head, to I am studying self-determination theory and talking about it because I believe that this is crucial to changing the world and creating a better global civilization. And those are both forms of extrinsic motivation. And so what self-determination theory does is it explains what the difference between those are. And it comes back again to these basic psychological needs. So,
sorry, just for the listener then to clarify, because it would seem like if you're interested in SDT to like help, bring like the Comedy Wonderland in, somehow it wouldn't seem an obvious thing that's extrinsic, say, versus the... Can you explain why that's extrinsic versus intrinsic? The army sergeant there who's going to shoot you in the back of the head if you don't get up, that you can understand that's completely external. I'm afraid of my life.
Yeah.
But it's not as obvious with the thing of like, say, why the hell you got into SDT, for example.
So yeah, great. So the answer is that it can be both, actually. And motivation is complex, and generally there's aspects, or there's a degree of each component happening at a given time. Okay. But the short answer is because doing things that we find to be important and meaningful and an expression of who we are not always easy. They're not always interesting, and they're not always enjoyable. Actually, often they're not. And when we think about the example of changing the world, of transforming global human civilization into one that's based on democracy and ecology and cooperation and so forth, we know that this is something which is usually actually very unpleasant. People get murdered for doing this. You have to make sacrifices. You have to do do boring things and so forth. And that is not intrinsically motivated. So you need something else to do that. This is actually something that's important for some sections of the left to understand as well, that, there can be this idea that activism should always be fun in the form of play. And actually, it can't. It can't. There's just a lot of drudgery and boring things and thankless work that has to be done. And so that then is going to be extrinsically motivated. An example I always give as well is the crying infant in the night. Who's getting up at 3 a.m. to soothe their crying child out of intrinsic motivation? Nobody. That's not enjoyable. Okay. Why do you do it? You do it because it aligns with your values, with who you are and what's meaningful to you and important to you.
No, that's wrong. You do it to make them shut the fuck up.
Yeah, you do that. You do that as well.
That's
You do that as well.
intrinsic. No, I'm joking.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So you do that as well. Okay, but things like you can extrapolate to other examples of child rearing and other things like it's speaking personally. It's fundamental to me. It's fundamental to who I am to try to make the world a better place and to change things. And that's something which has a cost. It means that I have to make. I'm not saying this to sound great or whatever. It's the same for anybody. It means I have to not do other things. And so that's because I have certain values. I see myself in a certain way. I see that as an expression of who I am. There's no distinction between that work and trying to change the world and myself. And so that is a form of extrinsic motivation, but it's an autonomous form of extrinsic motivation. Okay. And that's very different to when you only do something because you're given a wage, or you only do something because you want to get people to approve of you, or you want to relieve some shame, or you're afraid of being fired or punished or shouted at or. Okay.
So with this is what you call then well internalized extrinsic motivation.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's this idea of internalization. So the idea
I just
is
want to
that
point out because this is not going to be out in video, but when Ferdia gets excited, he starts like kind of pacing around the room like he's going to attack someone.
I'm in good company. I don't know. I mean, you like to pace around the room. I don't think you look like you're going to attack somebody, but you do like to. You're a very nomadic video call attendant.
Yes.
But anyway, so here's another thing which can be controversial, is that there's this very clear and rich notion of the self in self-determination theory. Oh, it's in the name, self-determination. Okay, there's a self, and that's something that can be well described and in many respects quantified. And so crucial, you're talking about internalization, is how we're talking about autonomy. It's how much do you endorse and have a true sense of choice over what you're doing. There are some things that we do. Yeah, so here we go. Just because somebody does something doesn't mean that it's autonomous, or they're truly choosing it, or stand behind it, or endorse it, or have taken it into themselves. That's a crucial distinction. And it's one of the key ways that we can pick apart and dismantle capitalist ideology, which is based on this liberal fallacy that just because people aren't being directly commanded and compelled through violence, immediate violence, that you're free. That's at the root of the justification of capitalism and how it is able to be described as a free society where people make choices and not coerced, and the emergent result of what people want. And if people don't like it, well, those are the choices that people made. Okay. Just because somebody does something doesn't mean they've taken it into themselves. Okay. So, and self-determination theory describes this well. So there's this spectrum of internalization. I won't give all of the. Okay, fine. I'll give some of the terminology. I'm not going to dwell on it. People don't have to memorize it. So there's external, there's introjected, there's identified, and there's integrated. So external is, will you clean my driveway for €10? Okay, or that thing, that example I gave of World War One in the trenches. I've blown the whistle. You're going over the top, or I'm going to shoot you. That's external. Okay, you haven't taken that into yourself at all. That's not self-generated. Or, maybe more relevant, write the report for the evil corporation, or else you're going to lose your job, and then you're not going to be able to pay rent, and so on and so on. You're acting almost like a robot. You're just executing instructions. It's not an expression of yourself at all. You're not taking it actually in you. And what happens then is, as soon as that external stimulus, whether it's the threat of punishment or the reward, is removed, the behavior stops, obviously. Okay. It's like the pigeon in the Skinner box. Sugar water is gone, behavior ceases. Or, and this is something where we go back to the basic psychological needs, because that undermines people's sense of autonomy so much, people dig their heels in, and in a desperate attempt to reassert the need for autonomy, will defy those instructions to the best they can get away with. And you can think about this as the spitting in the hamburger McDonald's phenomenon. Okay. The next thing is introjection. So the first thing, that's external pressure. You can think of it as external pressure. Okay. Now, internal pressure. This is my favorite because it's the most insidious and nuanced. Often people seem like they're self-motivated and they're doing things without anybody telling them what to do. No rewards, no threat of punishment. And it's because what's happened is we have partially internalized these motives. It's like the cuckoo's egg in the nest. It's a foreign invader put into our minds, not fully integrated, and that is shame, basically shame, guilt, and hubris. We internalize partially these messages from society about who we're supposed to be, the image we're meant to have, the status, the success, the power, and so forth. It could be anything really, and we feel compelled. We put this pressure on ourselves to live up to that. So that's called introjected self-regulation. You can think about that as internal pressure. And so, from the self-determination theory point of view, again, that's not a form of autonomous motivation. That's in the controlled portion. That's controlled motivation. And that has its own properties. So people can persist and do work really hard because of internal pressure, as we know. For example, coming back to those experiments about being given a puzzle and then looking at people through the one-way mirror and seeing how they behave. The one exception was that when you triggered something called ego involvement, so you said something like, oh, well, people who are really smart are able to do 10 puzzles in this time. Okay. Or see, can you beat everybody else? That triggers your sense of self-worth. When you did that to people, they would persist at the end. They would keep doing the puzzle. And the reason they did that was not intrinsic motivation. It was because they wanted to prove their self-worth, that they were good enough. So that's another form of motivation. And this is rife in society. You can see that external motivation. Okay, that capitalism fundamentally depends on that. It's functional to it. Because we live in a society where it doesn't actually align with human values. It doesn't align with basic psychological needs. You know, like who wants to do PR for an oil company that's destroying the planet or something like that? You know, you have to force people to do things through external compulsion, external pressure, and then also internal pressure. Internal pressure is the other way that capitalism functions, and it's one of the fundamental problems. I'd put that right there with, you know, economic crisis and so on. Is that capitalism systematically has to trigger people's ego involvement and make us feel bad about ourselves in order to get us to do things. Okay, and then going on from that, so we had external pressure and internal pressure. These are controlled motivation. Okay. Now we're on to, I'm not going to dwell much on the difference. Identified and integrated. This is autonomous motivation now. Autonomous, extrinsic. Sorry to listeners for the terminology, but it's things that your autonomous motivation are. This is optimal motivation, that it's healthy. There's a sense of choice, sense of autonomy over it. Okay. Now you're doing something because you actually value it. So maybe you're volunteering in a local group that, you know, works with children, something like that. Okay. And you do that because you want to make a difference in your community. That could be a form of identified self-regulation. So autonomous motivation, basically. Okay. There are many forms of this, but the point is that you're doing it out of a real sense of choice. Your basic psychological needs are satisfied. You're doing it in an aligned way. Somebody, a management consultant, actually calls it alignment, which I think is good. That's fundamentally what it is. So you're not doing it out of external pressure, you're not doing it out of internal pressure. There isn't the sense of guilt, of shame. There isn't the sense that I must do this because I have to get this reward, I have to get this approval, I have to move up the hierarchy or whatever. You're doing it because it's something that matters to you. And so that is then autonomous motivation. So when you take that alignment, and you take intrinsic motivation, so you do things because you're interested and you enjoy it, you put those together, that's all called autonomous motivation. And it's proven that autonomous motivation is associated with many positive things, and controlled motivation is associated with many negative things. So autonomous motivation is associated with creativity, better conceptual learning, flexibility, something called basically going the extra mile. So in an organizational citizenship behaviors. So that's when you do things that are in addition to your formal job. Resistance to burnout, job satisfaction, life satisfaction. All of these things are associated with autonomous motivation, and controlled is the opposite. So you can think about motivation as being polarized between these two types, where the autonomous is motivation is when your autonomy, your belonging, and your competence is satisfied. You're acting out of an alignment with yourself, or out of kind of spontaneous interest and enjoyment, and you experience that as energizing, as free, as something that gives you resilience and meaning. And then the opposite, you have control motivation, and that's when you are doing things just for instrumental reasons. You don't have a sense of control over it. You are just doing it because you're being told what to do, or because of some financial incentive, or because you feel this shame. And control motivation makes people feel tense. It causes physical illness. It causes us to burn out, to be less creative, to be less exploratory, and to be more aggressive, more competitive, more apathetic. And this obviously has enormous implications for political economy, apart from just life and the world.
Yeah, it makes you think a little bit about like sports people when they quit just being motivated through the competition, and then they fall into deep depression after they retire or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like sports, there's a lot of work on sports in self-determination theory. I mean, I should say as well, like self-determination theory is, I'm talking about this now as, a theorist of post-capitalism. Okay. But self-determination theory, it's not some fringe psychological theory. It has massive mainstream success. And it is particularly well established in the fields of sport, education, and parenting. And something about sport that's popped into my head there. There's been a lot of work on this, like coaching styles, for example, the effects that coaching styles have on athletes. If you have a coach which is autonomy supportive, athletes will persist better and generally perform better. And if you have a coach which is controlling, so it doesn't support autonomy, you will have athletes who are experience more burnout. They'll drop out, alternative training less. They won't perform as well. Scholarships, that's another thing that's been studied. Athletes getting scholarships to colleges, and how the ones who are awarded the scholarships enjoy it less. They enjoy the sport less than the ones who didn't get the scholarship. And now we're back to pressure and material rewards. And it's like the pursuit has been taken away from them. Now there's this expectation that they have to do something, they're being controlled. So I know that has popped into my head on the issue of sport. But there's a load of things like that in self-determination theory. Whatever topic you bring up, there's some study